During the colonial American era, we ultimately see the transition of labor from indentured servants to African slaves and the use of slave trade and plantation system. Colonies and settlements initially relied mainly on labor by indentured servants and to some extent slavery of Native Americans. However, hiring indentured servants became more expensive as the demand for labor increased. Furthermore, as more and more freed indentured servants demanded for land from their masters, conflicts arose such as Bacon's Rebellion that caused the landowners to fear insurrections. Landowners consequently began to prefer African slave labor as it was more cheap, profitable, and longer lasting. Africans were less susceptible to diseases such as malaria that were plaguing the southern colonies and unfamiliar with the new landscape, and their enslavement was considered to be more ethical than the enslavement of Europeans such as Catholics or Jews. Under the slave code, slaves were only considered as a piece of property and a source of labor. They could not own any property themselves. Slavery was legally recognized by many colonies as lifelong and hereditary, and laws favored and protected slave masters. Slaves weren't allowed any privacy or could not be grouped together without supervision of a white person and had to follow strict curfews to prevent rebellion or insurrection. They were constantly punished and overworked, and the death of a slave as a result of labor or severe punishment was lawfully excused. Slaves who escaped were often kidnapped and returned to their masters by acts such as the Fugitive Slave Act.
Slaves in the North were owned by the elite of colonial society and performed mainly household tasks as well as more skilled jobs such as artisanry, printing, banking, and tailoring. There were usually only several slaves to one household or business. Some slaves in the North served as agricultural workers, but to less of an extent than in the South. The North was more reliant on local indentured servants and was slower to accept slavery as a result. In the South, slaves were heavily employed in the labor-intensive process of cultivating cash crops. Slaves quickly replaced indentured servants because the latter was too expensive and not as profitable. Growing cash crops was an extremely intensive process. For instance, rice plantations required constant irrigation by over 30 slaves. As a result, slaves lived and worked on plantations. The plantation system generated large revenue from exporting cash crops to the North and to Europe due to the unpaid slave labor.
Southern colonies viewed slavery as a necessity to the betterment of the African slave. They believed that the Africans were incompetent and inferior to the white Americans and employed deliberate false interpretations of slave behavior to demonstrate to the North that the slaves were enjoying their labor. South supported African slavery because it was an economic necessity in order for Southern agrarian society. On the contrary, as the North was less involved in slavery, it had dichotomous viewpoints on the subject of slavery. Some colonies sought to place slavery in terms acceptable to the principles of theology and economy, considering slaves as both property and people able to attain salvation. Quakers were prominent opponents to slave trade because slavery clashed with the Quaker belief of equality for all.
Native Americans were also enslaved, but to a much lesser extent than African Americans. Native American tribes sold war captives from other tribes to the settlers, which were then shipped to Europe or indentured or enslaved in the New England and Southern colonies. The slave trade of Native Americans resulted in numerous conflicts amongst tribes competing for dominance and destabilized the slave trade system that the southern settlements were dependent on. Native Americans were also susceptible to various diseases such as malaria, and they had higher mortality rates. In addition, Native Americans were familiar with the land and could easily escape.
Servants were people who assigned an indentured contract willing to work for their masters for several years in exchange for transportation to colonial America and food, clothing, and shelter upon arrival. They were therefore willing to come to colonial America for the prospect of a better life rather than being kidnapped and forced like slaves. Like slaves, indentured servants were constantly overworked and beaten severely. Breaking the law, running away, and pregnancy could add years onto their contract terms of service. However, unlike slaves whose fate depended almost entirely on their masters, there were some laws that protected the servants' rights. For instance, upon expiration of contract, indentured servants were entitled to freedom dues, which included food, clothing, money, or sometimes land, and became free settlers, though many were not able to become wealthy. Nevertheless, many were satisfied with the fact that they were free after suffering the privilege journey to colonial America and the harsh labor as an indentured servant.
Patriarchy dominated colonial American society and colonial households, especially in heavily religion-influenced society such that of the Puritans, as women were excluded from decision-making processes. Religion furthered the subservience of women to man through sermons claiming that the masculine aspect of human soul was immortal, whereas the feminine aspect of the human soul was mortal. Women were limited to growing crops and raising their children and farm animals. They were not allowed to purchase land, sue in court, or speak in church. Women were ultimately judged on their ability to support the men of society and were forced to be subservient to them. In this manner, colonial women were similar in some regards to the slaves in that they too were considered legal property of their fathers before marriage and of their husbands after marriage, and were expected to be subservient to their male counterparts. It was also legal and morally acceptable at that time for males to exert power and violence over colonial women, similar to how practices were enforced by slave owners.